One of the aspects of Mae Brussels' work, which was most significant, was her work on a fellow named Fritz Kramer. Fritz Kramer was a German-born general who served, or German-born military officer, I should say, who served as the plans officer for the Department of the Army from 1949 through 1970 and continued to serve in an important advisory capacity for many years after that. His son Sven Kramer is still on the National Security Council and was retained by Frank Carlucci after Carlucci replaced Oliver North as White House National Security Advisor. The significance of Fritz Kramer, and Mae has developed some significant information indicating that Fritz Kramer is actually a former SS General Fritz Kramer, the Chief of Staff for the 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's top shock unit during World War II. Fritz Kramer's background is in the chemical industry. His family was in the chemical industry. This suggests, if indeed Mae's hypothesis is correct, and the supposedly two Fritz Kramers are really the same, that the American Fritz Kramer is actually the German Nazi SS General Fritz Kramer from the 6th SS Panzer Army. The Fritz Kramer family was very much hooked up with the chemical industry, and in Germany, the chemical industry, before the war, during the war, and to this day, is IG Farben. Period. That's all there is to it. It's worth noting, perhaps I think for our purposes here, that a definition of the German General Staff presented in a book called The Plot Against the Peace, authored by Michael Sayers and Albert E. Kahn, published by the Dial Press in March of 1945, entertains a definition of the German General Staff which is somewhat broader than the conventional approach to a general staff, and I think is important for our understanding here. In their definition of the German General Staff, they expanded, Sayers and Kahn, in The Plot Against the Peace, that is, expanded the definition to include the German industrialists for whom the generals and military worked, and underscored the fact that the relationship between these generals and industrialists was far closer than in most countries. It has been noted by a number of anti-fascist writers that many members of the German General Staff, in fact, were called IG generals. In the future, we're going to discuss a fellow named General Wilhelm von Faupel, F-A-U-P-E-L, one of the key German generals involved with setting up the relationship between Nazi Germany and the Falange in Spain, and also Falange, that's the fascist party of Spain under Franco, and also Falange branches in other Spanish-speaking parts of the world, such as Latin America and the Philippines. Von Faupel was an IG general, and IG Farben operated with great productivity in Latin America, among other places. IG Farben had a virtual monopoly on pharmaceuticals in Latin America. Von Faupel was an IG general, and if Mae Brussels' hypothesis about Fritz Kramer was correct, and I believe it is, and there's mounting indication that it is, then Fritz Kramer also, because of his family's background in the chemical the chemical industry in IG Farben, would be an IG general. Now, Fritz Kramer's protege, he has several of them, but one of his proteges is Henry Kissinger. And one of the things that's worth noting concerning the Galen organization, concerning the paperclip scientists were brought into this country, concerning Henry Kissinger. Many Kissinger appointees, by the way, many Kissinger associates are being appointed by George Bush. Brent Scowcroft, a key official with Kissinger's international consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, has been appointed by George Bush as his national security advisor. Scowcroft served on the Tower Commission. His cohort, former Senator John Tower of Texas, of course, is going to be Secretary of Defense. Lawrence Eagleburger, a key Kissinger protege, has been named Deputy Secretary of State under James Baker. It's worth noting the relationship between Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer and the many Kissinger proteges who were cropping up in the Bush administration. Now, traditionally, when nations have gone to war, the armies are generally used in order to acquire wealth from their enemies. Most wars have been struggles over goodies. Sometimes they're religious wars, but in general, wars are struggles over markets. Basically, somebody wants somebody else's goodies, and they fight for it. The armies have traditionally in history, and this is obviously not a revelation, this is pretty common notion, have been used to gain control of an opponent's wealth. One of the significant aspects, I think, that has been overlooked by people as they examine the Galen spy organization and the Nazi rocket scientists, many of them war criminals and SS men brought into the United States at the end of World War II, is that basically we were incorporating the German military, which we had been fighting just a few months before. People have noted that, but they have failed to take note of what Christopher Simpson has taken note of in his new book, or recent book, Blowback. One of the points that Christopher Simpson makes in Blowback, and we're going to go into this in some detail in weeks to come, is that by channeling false intelligence to the United States concerning Soviet capabilities and Soviet intentions, the Gehlen organization deliberately built up fear of the Soviet Union in the American citizenry and in the U.S. national security establishment. Eventually, the false intelligence being provided to the United States, the Soviet Union was being portrayed by the Gehlen organization as a huge, huge menace, whereas in fact, for all of its large standing army, the Soviet Union was badly damaged in World War II and did not represent an offensive threat to the United States, particularly not when the U.S. had the A-bomb and the Soviet Union didn't. The U.S. has always been well ahead of the Soviet Union in military power, and yet the Gehlen organization was very successful not only in convincing the American national security establishment, but also American conservative politicians that in fact the Soviet threat was much, much greater than it was. The profound Gehlen influence on the Reagan administration through the aforementioned von Bolschwing-von Dahm relationship should be borne in mind here. It should be noted that the United States, which was the world's greatest creditor nation in 1980, is now the world's biggest debtor nation in 1988 because of the extraordinary military buildup by the Reagan administration to combat this perceived menace. Ultimately, what has happened is, in order to defend itself against the Soviet Union, which is not the threat that the Gehlen organization made it out to be, the U.S. is now bankrupted. And the strongest economic powers in the world? The two Axis nations, former Axis nations, I think former might be and should be placed in quotes here, Japan and Germany. I think from a practical standpoint, the Gehlen organization can be viewed as something very similar to the old Trojan horse. During the Trojan Wars, the Greeks built a huge wooden horse. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story. They hid some soldiers inside and wheeled it up to the gates of Troy. The Trojans, viewing this as a gift from the gods and a sign of their impending victory, brought it inside and used it as the centerpiece in a celebration. Then, of course, the Greek soldiers came out and conquered Troy. In a very real way, the Gehlen organization and the paperclip scientists, particularly the Gehlen organization, have served as a Trojan horse for America. The United States literally wound up losing World War II. The gains that the German armies could not win on the battlefield were obtained when the German military was incorporated into the United States. And as a result of the bogus intelligence they have fed to the United States for the better part of a half a century, the U.S., in order to finance this crazy military buildup, is now bankrupt and is literally at this point, for all practical purposes, a German and Japanese colony. The United States now is totally in debt and is being supported. Our operations are being supported by the sale of high-interest treasury bills to the Japanese, the Germans, and to a lesser extent the Arabs. A colony is where you use your investment capital and the other guy's natural resources and labor in order to develop finished goods for your markets at home and for their markets, the colony's markets. I think people should consider to what extent the U.S. is now a German and Japanese colony. And again, I think as we see names like General Aniline in film cropping up, as we see some interesting connections between people like Arthur Lyman, companies like TCI, his law firm having incorporated TCI, von Bolschwing, the Gehlen organization, the Reagan administration, consider the Gehlen organization as a Trojan horse, and consider to what extent that organization literally affected the military conquest of the United States, not by defeating American armies on the battlefield by force of arms, but by channeling and misleading the United States, both politically and militarily, about Soviet aims, thereby achieving German goals in World War II. And again, the Trojan horse metaphor, I think, is important. And remember Kissinger, his relationship with Fritz Kramer, who, if May Brussels' hypothesis is correct, is an IG general. Okay? By way of contemplating the colonization of Germany, in as much as, again, for people who will later hear this program on tape, in as much as it's now, it is today, January 15th of 1989, Martin Luther King's birthday, and in as much as this is the weekend that is set aside, tomorrow's a national holiday, to observe Dr. King's birthday, I think it might be worth contemplating not only a couple of aspects of the past presidential campaign, including the racist aspects of that presidential campaign, might also be worth contemplating just how far from Dr. King's dream the present American political reality is. At the end of the Mary McGrory column I read you at the beginning of the prepared portion of tonight's broadcast, Mary McGrory makes an interesting observation. Somebody besides Gazelle and Walsh may have an interest in finding out the truth and applying the principles of justice. But to exhibit it is to risk being thought vindictive, unquote, or even worse, negative. The law is for the likes of Willie Horton, not for a Marine who said he would stand on his head in a corner if the president told him so. Willie Horton, of course, was a convicted black rapist whose parole or release from prison and subsequent crime became a cause célèbre for the Bush campaign and did a lot of damage to Michael Dukakis. The fact that it was not Michael Dukakis' furlough program which released Willie Horton got right on by the American people, as so many things have gotten by the American people. Contemplating the recent presidential campaign, I think a very important column appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle of Wednesday, December 7th of 1988. This is an analysis of that campaign by James Michener, the well-known author. And this Michener column is, well, basically there are two. There's a Jim Leach, a Republican, and James Michener, a Democrat. I'm not going to read you Jim Leach, but James Michener said the following concerning the recent presidential campaign. This from the San Francisco Chronicle. Michener's column is headed, "Campaign had ominous signs of American fascism." It should be noted here that James Michener, as we'll see, is no screaming liberal. In fact, he's a hard-nosed Cold Warrior, literally a Cold War liberal. But again, this column, "Campaign had ominous signs of American fascism" by James Michener. San Francisco Chronicle, Wednesday, December 7th of 1988. This year's election scared me. It was conducted with a brutality and lack of attention to basic issues which appalled, and the success of its ugly strategies flashed signals that this was the kind of electioneering we should expect during the next 3 national campaigns of this century. What frightened me? The tactics that proved so effective were those which Joseph Goebbels found useful in destroying the German Republic in the 1930s. First, the big lie, the endless repetition until it becomes accepted truth, and the desire to destroy the opposition rather than refute its arguments. Second, appropriating the emotional symbols of nationhood such as the flag, the Pledge of Allegiance, prayer in schools, exaltation of the family, opposition to abortion, and a macho boast that all citizens have the right to carry firearms and use them at will. Third, denouncing anyone who did not pass those self-imposed litmus tests as outside the mainstream, unpatriotic, and perhaps even treasonous. Fourth, the callous use of race, in the case of Willie Horton, to inflame prejudices and divide the population. Michael Dukakis was not defeated, he was destroyed, and that kind of victory does not serve the Republic well. If persisted in, it could lead to American-style fascism. I am a liberal Democrat who unsuccessfully ran for Congress in 1962, one of the best things I've ever done, for it taught me facts about American political life. As a member of the board of directors of Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, which strive to present an honest portrait of our nation abroad, I am an anti-communist warrior. Early in 1988, I realized that the Democrats probably could not win this year, and recommended that they offer a ticket that was boldly liberal, that tried to further the agenda of Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, and, if necessary, accept Jesse Jackson on the ticket as vice president in hopes of whipping up enthusiasm and determination to capture the presidency in 1992. Halfway through the Democratic National Convention, when enthusiasm was at its height, I wrote, quote, "The election is lost. The images coming out of the convention will terrify the South and alienate the Midwest, and Dukakis will be lucky if he can hold Bush's electoral vote to under 500, unquote. I was referring to the impression that Jesse Jackson was running the show, and that the cameras were focusing only on black faces. This did not worry me, for I had already conceded this election and was looking forward to 1992, when an old-style coalition of liberals would have a chance at sweeping the country as Roosevelt had done 60 years earlier in 1932. I never remotely believed the poll figures showing Dukakis ahead by 17 points, and was not surprised when that lead vanished after the Republican National Convention, where George Bush presented himself and his program brilliantly. But I was not prepared for the supine way in which Dukakis allowed Bush to steal the limelight, establish the agenda, and paint Dukakis as a secret, dangerous liberal and Bush as the protector of all that was good in American life. I have the highest admiration for the tough, amoral men who engineered the Bush campaign. They realized what had to be done and how to best do it. Their adroit manipulation of the Pledge of Allegiance, a rubric invented by the editor of Boys magazine to spur sales, was brilliant, as was the draping of gigantic flags about their candidate. Also, once they had Dukakis knocked down, they never allowed him to get off the floor, and the way they contrived to have Senator Dan Quayle confront the press in a rowdy public meeting in his own backyard, where the media could be made the enemy, was an act of genius. However, the Bush men did corrupt the political system, and, in a time of quiet and growing crisis, they prevented any reasonable debate on the great issues facing this nation. As a consequence, we have postponed rather than solved our problems, and when the due bills are presented, the results may be devastating. Again, resuming. As a consequence, we have postponed rather than solved our problems, and when the due bills are presented, the results may be devastating. What are these problems? Consider the enormous burden of debt whose management tempts us into so many false steps. The imbalance in our trade with foreign nations so that we became a consuming nation rather than a producing one. The abandonment of one major area of production after another to other nations better organized, trained, and disciplined than our own. I refer to steel, automobiles, communication systems, shipping, clothing, shoes, and even minor items like the printing of books. The constant selling off of our capital goods to foreigners at bargain basement prices. The debasement of our public schools so that we send half-educated young people to compete against fully educated Japanese, Germans, and Koreans. The determined swing of our judiciary to the hard right so that the natural changes that all societies need to survive will probably be inhibited as civil liberties are lost. We divert so much of our wealth to the servicing of our trillion-dollar debt that most of the taxes I pay go to service debt. We are making bankers richer and workers poorer, and I expect this imbalance to worsen. Because we have a consuming rather than a producing nation, my home is filled with Japanese products like televisions, sound systems, and, perhaps next time, a Japanese car. I am surrounded by products made in Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Germany, and Spain, but few made in the United States. When I go on vacation, it's in foreign ships, Dutch, Norwegian, Italian, Greek, British, and never American. In Honolulu recently, I was shocked to find in the local papers 4-page color ads printed half in English, half in Japanese, for simultaneous distribution in Tokyo and Osaka, offering scores of fine Hawaiian homes for sale to Japanese businessmen, investments sure to increase in value, plus enticing messages to Honolulu residents. Quote, "List your homes and condos with us, and we will sell them to Japanese buyers at great profit to you." In a significant part of my own profession, I work not for American publishers, but for the two big German houses, Octopus and Bertelsmann. The decline in American education shocks me, and I have heard the manager of an important company tell me, quote, "I've given orders to personnel, hire no more graduates from blank college because they cannot read or write and understand directions." Colleges now use texts not as difficult as those I taught in high school half a century ago. But it is the prospect of seeing 4 or 5 ultra-right-wing justices on the Supreme Court that really scares me, for then the subtle balances that have prevailed in our civic life may be destroyed. I think people should take note of the growing xenophobia in this country. The street-level fascists, such as the Nazi skinheads that are gaining increasing publicity and are increasingly violent and well-organized, as well as the Aryan Nations elements that we're about to take a look at, are able to correctly, to a certain extent, maintain that America is deliberately being handed to foreigners. Of course, they then cite the Jews and the blacks and other people, although these street Nazis, as I call them, your Nazi skinheads, your Aryan Nations types, they're not to be overlooked, by the way. They have strong connections to the national security establishment, as we looked at in Radio Free America shows 10 through 13. But although they cite Asians as a menace, they don't tend to act against Asians, at least not to the same extent that they do against blacks and Jews and Mexicans. I think it's worth noting, for our purposes here, that the arguments presented by the skinheads, by the Nazi skinheads, I should say, because they're not all Nazis by any means, but not by Nazi skinheads, by the Aryan nations, that the American working man is being left out in the cold, that the nation is being sold out to foreigners and, racially inferior types, that will meet with a lot of sympathy at the street level because, in fact, a lot of people are out of work. The very factors that James Michener cited in his column are facts. So I think, although obviously the philosophy is corrupt and is to be opposed, its marketability under the current climate is not to be overlooked. And indeed, as we contemplate Dr. King's life and work, I think we may want to take note of just how far we've sunk from the ideals Dr. King expressed. A chilling article was researched for us by a listener. This from the Deseret News of Salt Lake City from Saturday, November 19th of 1988. This is by Joel Campbell, a Deseret News staff writer, headlined, "Supremacists' Secret Sessions with Ogden Police Stir Fears." The white supremacist who was paid $700 to speak to the Ogden police during secret sessions last week said he found an enthusiastic, unquote, crowd. But Ogden Police Chief Joe Ritchie says the enthusiasm was only an interest in understanding the doctrine that motivates supremacists. And the leader of a local human rights group said that Ritchie made a mistake by inviting Richard Masker, M-A-S-K-E-R, especially in light of the fact that Masker felt his message was accepted by police officers. Quote, "Our greatest fear is that by choice or by change, this may have turned into a recruitment," unquote, said Noni Gilbert, a resident of Davis County and co-chairwoman of a group called Aryan Watch, unquote. She said the 50-member organization is working against efforts by white supremacists to establish a foothold in Weber and Davis counties, and said similar anti-Aryan groups are active in Salt Lake and Utah counties. Quote, "I am offended. I was in shock when I got the first phone call. I think this secrecy thing scares me to death. Using public money was probably wildly inappropriate," unquote. Skipping down. In a telephone interview from Church of Jesus Christ Christian Church headquarters in Hayden Lake, Idaho, Masker said that he felt that a lot of the police officers knew he was, quote, "telling the truth," unquote. Interrupting, down below we're going to see just what he was telling them, so that last comment is to be borne in mind. Again, repeating that last sentence. In a telephone interview from Church of Jesus Christ Christian, Church headquarters in Hayden Lake, Idaho, Masker said that he felt that a lot of the police officers knew he was, quote, "telling the truth," unquote. Again quoting, "You know when you were talking to 125 police officers totally programmed by the system," Masker said. Quote, "But the vast majority of the presentations were received with what appeared to be enthusiasm. There was a lot of officers that knew I was telling them the truth, and they were very receptive," unquote. Again skipping down. Masker said he told police about his thoughts on what he calls a Marxist, Zionist, coalitionist conspiracy to control the United States. While emphasizing the conspiracy has wrongly allowed the equality of minorities, he said his was not a racist message. Quote, "I talked to the police force basically on underlying causes for the right-wing movement in the country, that there is a shadow government, and that people are awakening to a sense of their awful situation. It identifies the conspirators, and I gave a history of their activities and showed their mode of operation," unquote. Masker said he felt well accepted by the police because Ritchie told him if officers didn't like the first session, he would stop Masker. Again quoting, "After the first session, he overwhelmingly endorsed it and said we will continue with the series and would even recommend to the police chief of Spokane that he have me in to conduct a seminar to the Spokane Police Department," Masker said. The police were given 4 identical 3-hour sessions on November 8th through 9th. The whereabouts and nature of the meetings were highly guarded. Masker lectured for 2 hours and then answered questions. Gilbert said she finds it an odd coincidence that Masker lectured during a day that Jews throughout the world remembered Kristallnacht or Crystal Night when Nazis rampaged against Jews in 1938. Masker said he has no affiliation with violent groups like the Order or Reverend Richard Butler's Aryan Nations. I would interrupt the fact that he was called from the head of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, the Church of Jesus Christ Christian Church headquarters in Hayden Lake, Idaho. That's where Butler operates out of, so obviously this is less than candid. Returning again to this paragraph, Masker said he has no affiliation with violent groups like the Order or the Reverend Richard Butler's Aryan Nations. Masker, however, said Butler is a good friend, but is not part of work to move an Aryan Nations office to Utah. He said he is a political scientist and must remain unbiased and non-prejudicial in his work. Again, skipping down. Masker said the invitation to speak came as a result of a meeting with Ritchie, that's the chief of police of Ogden, during his visit to Coeur d'Alene last December. Since that time, he has communicated often with Masker. I think we've become good friends. That is why he invited me down. He wanted me to share with his police officers the conspiratological message that I have. After losing his city water supervisor job in Corvallis, Oregon in 1983 for mailing Adolf Hitler birthday cards to Jews, Masker moved to Kootenai County and initially stayed at the Aryan Nations Church compound. Masker now heads what he calls the International Conspiratological Association, unquote, and is a spokesman for the League of Pace Amendment Advocates, a Glendale, California organization that believes the 14th Amendment wrongly allowed blacks and other minorities to become American citizens. The amendment has caused racial strife and revolution in the United States, Masker said. And again, his views, what he was lecturing to them about, what he found such enthusiasm, Masker said he told police about his thoughts on what he calls a Marxist, Zionist, coalitionist conspiracy to control the United States. While emphasizing the conspiracy has wrongly allowed the equality of minorities, he said his was not a racist message. And it's interesting that he's involved with the spokesman for the League of Pace Amendment Advocates of Glendale, California. As if that story wasn't chilling enough, there are indications that this message is spreading in American police departments. From the San Jose Mercury News of today, Sunday, January 15th of 1989, the following AP story from San Bernardino, California. That's not too far from Glendale. They're both in the L.A. area. Mayor vows to fire racist letter writers. San Bernardino's mayor has vowed to fire those responsible for placing racist letters in the lockers of 2 black police officers who were threatened with violence if they took a promotional exam. The incident was revealed Friday by Police Chief Donald Burnett, who also vowed to request an FBI investigation if those responsible don't come forward within a week. Quote, the unacceptable conduct exhibited was blatant racial bigotry against 2 black police officers, said Mayor Evelyn Wilcox. The person or persons involved used threats and written language of the lowest order, unquote. Officials said an internal investigation is focusing on employees of the police department, and Wilcox said those identified as the letter writers would be fired. The mayor also issued a public apology to the officers who were not identified. The letters, signed by a group calling itself the Aryan Police Officers Association, threatened to harm the officers and their wives and children if they took an oral examination they must pass to be considered for promotion to the rank of corporal. Both officers took the test, but the results were not available. The incident was the latest of several in which black police officers in this city 55 miles east of Los Angeles have been threatened or harassed anonymously by others in the department, officials said. Several weeks ago, a black officer found black shoe polish smeared in his locker, officials said. A few days after that, the same officer found his locker sprayed with black paint. The Aryan Police Officers Association, huh? Think about it. Now, all of the archive shows featured on, all of the archive shows alluded to on these broadcasts, as well as the program that I've just put into the archives this evening. And again, it's going to be called The December Surprise, The Politics of Terror and the Exoneration of the Secret Team. All of the archive shows are on permanent file with a tape duplication service. The name of that duplication service is Archives on Audio. That's Archives on Audio, P.O. Box 170023, Box 170023. That's in San Francisco, zip code 94117-0023, 94117-0023. The phone number is area code 415-346-1840, 1-800-346-1840. Write or phone to the attention of Paul. And again, neither myself nor the station makes money off of this arrangement. That's Archives on Audio, Box 170023, San Francisco, California, 94117-0023. 415-346-1840. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks so much for listening. Good night. Take care of yourselves. And again, I hope the information tonight has been made clear enough. I realize it's a complicated thesis that I've been presenting, a complicated working hypothesis. Elements of it are certainly speculative, and I'd be the first to admit it, as I like to say, food for thought and grounds for further research. But I think the fact that Flight 103's crash would have precluded the release of the North counter-terrorist documents, I think can be put in the bank. As I say, the December surprise, the politics of terror, and the exoneration of the secret team. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.